For the modern man, there always seems something uncertain in the prophecy of future events. We have already seen that in connection with the 7 seals, we had to point out facts which are to come in the evolution of mankind. And as we unveil the Apocalypse of John, more and more we shall have to exercise this prophetic art. The question now is, what grounds are there for speaking at all of these things? We have already referred, in part, at the beginning of our lectures, to what lies at the basis of this. We said that at a certain stage of initiation, the initiate sees in the spiritual world what descends later and becomes a physical event. But in the last 2 lectures, we have shown that there is another basis for the prophetic art. We showed how man has developed out of spiritual spheres to his present existence. Now the whole of the future is in a certain sense a repetition of the past. Not that the things of the past will happen again in the same way, but past events repeat themselves in future times in a changed form. In our last lectures, we pointed out that in the ancient Atlantean epoch, man had a kind of clairvoyance, and that, especially during his night condition, he consciously ascended into spiritual worlds. And we must clearly understand that the condition of a certain clairvoyance will be repeated in mankind. Between the Atlantean epoch and the one that will come after the war of all against all, we have our epoch, which we have described. In a certain way, what existed previously, what was in the Atlantean epoch, will be repeated after our epoch, but there will be a very great difference. In the Atlantean epoch, man had a dreamy, hazy, clairvoyant consciousness. And when he ascended into the higher worlds, his clear consciousness of self faded, and he then felt himself within the group soul. After the great war of all against all, man will again see into the higher worlds in a certain way. He will again have the former hazy clairvoyance, but in addition he will possess what he has gradually acquired in the external physical world. Between the Atlantean flood and the great war of all against all, man has had to renounce for a time the power to see into the spiritual world. He has had to content himself with seeing only what is around him in the physical world, in so-called waking consciousness. This is now the normal condition. But in its place, it has become possible for him fully to develop his consciousness of self, his individual ego during this time, to feel himself within his skin as a separate ego personality, so to speak. This he has won. Now he also retains this individuality when he again rises into the higher spiritual worlds. And this ascent will be possible for him after the great war of all against all. But this ascent would not be possible if he had not taken part in that great cosmic event in the middle of our epoch, which runs its course in the physical world, as was shown in the last lecture. Man would have been obliged to sink down into a kind of abyss, had he not been preserved from it by the entry of Christ into our world. We must keep in mind that man has descended completely into the physical world in this epoch of ours. Let us represent the physical plane by this horizontal line. Above it what is called the spiritual, the heavenly world, and below it what is called the abyss. Man really reaches the line separating the spiritual world from the abyss in the 4th age, which we have described. We described the ancient Indian age, when man was still, on the whole, in the spiritual sphere. Previously he was above in the spiritual world, In Atlantis he still had a dim clairvoyance. He now comes down and reaches the line during the period of the Roman Empire. In this empire man became fully conscious as an external sense being, as a personality. That was at the time when the Roman idea of justice came into the world, when everyone's aim was to be a separate personality, an individual citizen. Man had then reached the line. At this point it was possible either to return or sink below it. We have now, in fact, reached a point in human evolution, and all that I am saying is in accordance with the apocalyptic presentation, when in a certain way mankind is confronted by the need for a decision. We have already shown that in our age an enormous amount of spiritual energy is used to provide for the lowest needs. We have shown how the telephone, telegraph, railway, steamboat, and other things still to come have absorbed a tremendous amount of spiritual force. They are only used for the mere satisfaction of lower human needs. Man, however, has only a certain amount of spiritual force. Now, consider the following. Man has used an enormous amount of spiritual force in order to invent and construct telephones, railways, steamboats, and airships, in order to further external culture. This had to be so. It would have gone badly with mankind if this had not come about. This spiritual power has also been used for many other things. Only consider how all social connections have gradually been spun into an extremely fine intellectual web. What tremendous spiritual force has been expended, so that one may now draw a check in America and cash it in Japan. An enormous amount of spiritual force has been absorbed in this activity. These forces had, so to speak, to descend below the line of the physical plane, which separates the spiritual kingdom from the abyss. For in a certain way man has actually already descended into the abyss, and one who studies the age from the standpoint of spiritual science can see by the most mundane phenomena how this goes on from decade to decade, how a certain point is always reached where the personality can still keep a hold on itself. If at this point it allows itself to sink down, the personality is lost. It is not rescued and lifted into the spiritual worlds. This may be illustrated by the most mundane things. I could prove it to you, for example, in the details of the development of the banking system in the second half of the 19th century. Perhaps it is only for future historians to show clearly that a fundamental change then came about, which we may describe by saying that in banking affairs the personality was gradually shattered. I should have to draw your attention to the time when the four Rothschilds went out into the world from Frankfurt, one to Vienna, another to Naples, the third to London, the fourth to Paris. The whole banking system was then brought into a personal sphere by the personal talent directed to it. The personality immersed itself in finance. Today you see banking affairs becoming impersonal. Capital is passing into the hands of joint stock companies. It is no longer managed by the individual personality. Capital is beginning to control itself. Purely objective forces are working in capital, and there are already forces in this realm which draw the will of the personality to themselves, so that the personality has become powerless. Thus, with seeing eyes, one can penetrate into these mundane things, and one can see everywhere how mankind, as regards the personality, has descended to the lowest depths. Now the personality may save itself and ascend again. It can save itself, for example, by really learning to strengthen its inner soul forces and depend upon itself, and make itself independent of the objective forces of capital. But the personality may also throw itself into these forces. It may, in a certain way, sail into and plunge into the abyss by allowing itself to be ensnared by the forces active in capital. The most important point of time, when the human personality descends to the earth and would have to turn back again, is the point of time of the appearance of Christ Jesus on the earth. He gave to the earth the power which made it possible for man to rise again, and he rises to the extent to which he has fellowship with Christ Jesus, to the extent that for a large part of mankind the understanding will dawn for what this event signified, so that for a large part of mankind this Christ impulse becomes the innermost impulse of man's being, from which he works in life. To this extent will mankind ascend again. Men must learn to understand more and more what St. Paul said, "It is not I who work, but Christ works in me." Therefore, if the impulse which descended to the physical world in the fourth age enters into the hearts of men, if it becomes the impulse behind their activity, then the ascent takes place, and all the souls who find this union with the Christ principle find the way upward. But all the souls who failed to find this union would have gradually to go down into the abyss. They would have gained the ego, they would have attained egoism, but would not be in a position to rise up again with this ego into the spiritual world. And the consequence for a man who makes no connection with the Christ principle would be that he disconnects himself from the spiritual ascent. Instead of ascending, he would descend and harden himself more and more in his ego. Instead of finding in matter just the opportunity to develop the ego and then rise up again, he would only descend deeper and deeper into matter. Yes, everything repeats itself. The possibility arose for man to enter our physical world. By surviving the Atlantean flood, it has become possible for him to create and develop his present human countenance. This is really an image of the spiritual ego-divinity dwelling in man. Toward the end of the Atlantean epoch, the etheric body united with the physical. Its forces drew into the physical head, and thereby man received his present human countenance, through which the Spirit of God shines. Let us suppose that he were to deny that it was the Spirit which has given him the human countenance. Then he would not use the body as an opportunity to attain the ego consciousness and again spiritualize himself, but he would grow together with the body and love it so much that he would only feel himself at home in it. He would remain united with the body and go down into the abyss. And because of not having used the power of the Spirit, the external shape would again come to resemble the previous form. The man who descends into the abyss would become animal-like. Thus mankind would realize what we have already indicated. Those who use the life in the body for anything more than an opportunity to gain ego consciousness will descend into the abyss and form the evil race. They have turned away from the impulse of Christ Jesus, and from the ugliness of their souls they will again create the animal form man possessed in former times. The evil race, with its savage impulses, will dwell in animal form in the abyss. And when up above those who have spiritualized themselves, who have received the Christ principle, announce what they have to say regarding their union with the name Christ Jesus, here below in the abyss will sound forth names of blasphemy. The desire to escape would appear as spiritual transformation. A person who thinks superficially might say at this point, Yes, but very many have lived who have experienced nothing of the Christ impulse. Why should not these have partaken in the impulse of Christ Jesus? This is objected from the materialistic side. Why should salvation only come with Christ Jesus? If persons who are not anthroposophists say it, then it is comprehensible. But if anthroposophists say it, then it is incomprehensible, for they ought to know that man returns again and again, and the souls which lived in earlier times will return in new bodies in the period after the event of Christ, so that there are none who could not participate in the event of Christ Jesus. Such an objection can only be made by one who does not believe in reincarnation. Thus we see how the division takes place. There will come a time when those who have striven for spiritualization will be capable of living in the spiritual world, a time when what they have formerly acquired will be made manifest, when they will bear the name of Christ on their forehead, because they learned to look up to him. Now, when the seal is opened, man will have imaged in his outward form what he bears inwardly in his heart. One who inwardly bears Christ in his soul will, after the unsealing, bear in his face the sign of Christ. His external form will be like Christ Jesus. But those who will remain in the cultures before the appearance of Christ Jesus will have to experience something else. These four cultures, the ancient Indian, Persian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Chaldean, Egyptian, Jewish, and the Greco-Latin, were preparatory ages. The soul had to go through the bodies of these civilizations in order to prepare itself for the great event of the appearance of Christ Jesus on earth. During the period of preparation, two forces held sway. The forces which brought men together are forces which have their material foundation in the blood. If men had simply been placed side by side in their present form, what was to develop in mankind would never have come about. Prior to the earth, the ancient moon was the bearer of our creation. This ancient moon was the cosmos of wisdom. Our earth is the cosmos of love. It is the mission of our earth to unite mankind in love. In the future, when the seventh trumpet has sounded and the earth has dissolved, when it has lost its physical substantiality, it is changed into an astral heavenly body, then love, the force of love, mankind will have developed in all things earthly, will have flowed into the whole human race. For this power of love must flow in as the earth mission of mankind, just as you now see the power of wisdom in your environment. We have often pointed to the miraculous wisdom found in the structure of even a little piece of thigh bone. It does not consist of a compact mass, but of many delicate lattice-like structures, which are so wonderfully put together that the greatest carrying capacity is attained with the expenditure of the smallest amount of matter, such as no engineer of the present day can achieve. And if we were to examine everything, we would find that the wisdom man has gained in the course of his earthly evolution was already contained in the earth. How often have we been told in the course of history lessons that man has made continual progress, and that he has grown wiser and wiser? You will remember how the stages of increasing wisdom were presented. For example, you were shown that at the beginning of modern times, man arrived at the point when he invented gunpowder, paper from rags, paper from wood pulp, and so on. Your soul was delighted at man's ascent. By means of his intellect, man had learned to make paper. One might suppose it was an original invention. But to one who contemplates the world in its totality, this appears in a different light. Wasps could do this long before, for a wasp's nest is constructed of material which is exactly the same as paper. Thus, thousands of years before, in the nest of the wasp, there already existed what man afterward achieved through his subjective wisdom. It is not the single wasp that can make paper, but the group soul, the ego which holds together the whole group of wasps. It possessed this wisdom long before man, and wherever you look, if you are not blind, you will find wisdom in everything. Do not imagine that this wisdom had to develop. The world was not always thus filled with wisdom. It was only during the moon evolution that it gradually flowed into all that now surrounds us. During the moon period, what was all chaos was rearranged so as to acquire wisdom. If you could direct your gaze to the moon evolution, you would find everything chaotic, but as yet with no wisdom. Only in the course of the moon evolution was wisdom poured into the various beings and creations, so that it was there by the time the earth came forth from the twilight. All things are then filled with wisdom. And as man today looks into his environment and sees wisdom burgeoning in everything, so will he, when he has reached Jupiter, see all the beings around him in a remarkable way. They will pour out something like the fragrance of blissful love. Love will stream forth from all things, and it is the mission of the earth evolution to develop this love. Love will then flow through everything, just as wisdom now reigns in everything. And this love is poured into earthly evolution by man's gradually learning to develop love. He was not able to have spiritual love immediately. Love had first to be implanted in him at the lowest level. It had to have a material vehicle, namely the blood relationship. The first schooling was to exercise love in the realm of blood relationship. The separated human beings were brought together because what coursed through their veins was imbued with love. This was the preparatory school of love. It was, in fact, the great school of love, and the great impulse which spiritualizes this love, which does not merely allow it to remain where it works physically, but imparts it to the soul, is the Christ impulse in the world. Now, had only this one impulse of love in blood brotherhood operated, mankind's evolution would have taken a strange course throughout the whole of antiquity. The beings who were the guides of the ancient times, and above all Yahweh, led men together in love, so that they united in blood relationship. But if men had been united only through blood relationship before the appearance of Christ Jesus, then individual human beings would never have been able to progress to personality. The individual would have been submerged in the tribe. As it was, the individual did very much lose himself in the whole. The consciousness that one is an individual human being only developed very gradually. In the Atlantean epoch, there could be no question of a man feeling himself as an individual being, and this was also the case much later. People now do not understand how names were given in ancient times, otherwise they would discover how men then felt. Think of the people of the Old Testament. In pre-Christian times, they experienced their ego, if they wished to feel it aright, by no means in their separate personality. Each one who thoroughly felt the impulse that streams from the Old Testament said, "I and Father Abraham are one." For he felt that he was secure in this community which reached back to Abraham, whose blood flowed through all the generations, down to the youngest. Hence he said, "I feel that I am not a lost member when I sense that my blood is the same as that of my father Abraham." And they tried to follow the community back still further. They felt secure in the group soul. They pointed to Noah, to Adam. It is no longer known what these names signify. It is not known that in those ancient times the consciousness of man was quite different from what it is today. A person can only remember with difficulty what happened in his childhood, and memory certainly stops at birth. In the time of the patriarchs, a man remembered not only what he himself had experienced, but what his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had experienced. This was in his memory, just as with you is the remembrance of your childhood. He did not know that his own life began with his birth. Memory reached back for hundreds of years. No name was given to the separate consciousness, for there would have been no meaning in it. As a person remembered the experiences of his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, etc., a common name included the whole chain. The names Adam or Noah signify the remembrance which passed through the generations. As far as the memory of the experience of Noah extended, the chain was called Noah. This was an inner man, a spiritual being, who lived through several generations. It would have been considered meaningless to give a name to the outer man. Thus the name Adam applied to a spiritual being. The individual man was not yet aware of his ego. He would have merged with the community but for the impulses which continually attacked this mingling in the community, and whose object was to tear man away from the blood ties and bring him to independence. In his astral body nestled certain spiritual beings who gave him the impulse not to allow his consciousness to become submerged. These were the Luciferic beings. It was they who in pre-Christian times worked against this uniformity, and it is to them that man owes his independence, his developing personality. It is extremely important to understand that we owe to Yahweh the striving for unification, and to the Luciferic spirits the striving for separation. In the early ages of Christianity there was a saying which ran, Christus verus Luciferus, that is, Christ is the true light-bearer, for Lucifer means light-bearer. Why is Christ called the true light-bearer? Because through him has now become justified what previously was not justified. Previously there was a tearing asunder. Men were not mature enough to be independent. Through the ego impulse which they received through Christ Jesus, they had progressed so far that in spite of the ego they could develop love for one another. Thus what Lucifer wished to give to mankind in anticipation, so to speak, when mankind was still not sufficiently mature, was brought at length by the true light-bearer, Christ Jesus. He brought the impulse for independence, but he also brought the spiritual love which unites those who are not related by blood. Through him came the epoch when mankind matured to the point which Lucifer previously wished to bring about. This saying, Christus verus Luciferus, was later no longer understood. He alone who rightly understands it learns to know the first teachings of Christianity. We have, therefore, to comprehend this impulse in this way. We have to see how man was prepared for the standpoint he had to attain. Thus the Indian, Persian, Egyptian, Greco-Latin periods were times of preparation pointing to the great Christ event. But it is possible for man to harden himself, as it were. Let us imagine a person living at the time of Christ Jesus, and let us imagine that he could consciously decide what he wished to do. If Christ Jesus were to come, he could say, "Oh, what was there previously is sufficient for me. I wish to know nothing about him. I will have no fellowship with Christ Jesus." He would have in his soul the forces, the impulses, which could be acquired in the time before Christ Jesus, which could be gained through the Indian, Persian, Egyptian, and Greco-Latin cultures. But in cosmic evolution, a man ought only to have such impulses until a new one arrives. If he stands still, then he remains behind. So we must not misunderstand historical development. We must not say that the same principle works in all cultures, for it is not for nothing that one is built up on another. Let us suppose someone wished to sleep through the Christian development. He would then live into the future, until after the great war of all against all. But he would have nothing of the great love principle of Christ, which brings the egos together, which makes communities of individuals. He would have everything which leads the egos into the abyss. He would have the separating, splintering forces. This brings us to a consideration which may give rise to the question: why does the unveiling of the first 4 seals provide such a comfortless picture? Because here comes forth those who wish to remain in these 4 preparatory cultures, in which is contained the old form of Lucifer that drives men asunder. Hence, in the unveiling of the seals, we are shown too how they received the form which they have acquired. They have slept through the event of Christ Jesus, and are reborn in the forms which can be given them without the influence of the Christ principle. Hence there appears again what shows nothing but intelligence, the mere intellect. The horse appears 4 consecutive times. The old form of man appears, which he obtained by receiving into himself the horse nature. This form appears at the opening of the first 4 seals. And when the 5th seal is opened, what is then brought to our notice? Those who in the preceding period have learned to understand the event of Christ Jesus. These are clothed in white garments. They have been passed by. Figuratively, they have been slain. They are those who are preserved for the spiritualization of the world. Thus, it is the union with the Christ principle which brings it about that men have these white garments and appear when the 5th seal is opened. Here we see a clear indication that the time when Christ appears is an important epoch for mankind. It is the epoch which brings it to pass that after the war of all against all, the 4 ages again appear, when those who have remained behind are tormented by the materiality which has proceeded with evolution and to which they have chained themselves. They are tormented by all the evils and torments of coarsened, hardened materiality. Everything which is now described in the breaking of the seals represents nothing else than the descent into the abyss. While in the 5th period we are only briefly directed to those who are chosen, we are shown for the rest all those who remain in materiality, who go down into the abyss, who assume the forms which existed previously because they did not progress, because they have not acquired the power to transform these shapes. You may form a picture of it. Imagine that your human forms were today made of India rubber, and within this rubber, human body, is your inner soul power, which gives this rubber body its human form. Imagine that we take out the soul force. Then the rubber body would collapse. Men would receive animal forms. The moment you drew the soul out of this human body of rubber, man would manifest the animal form. What man has gained for himself is like something which he produces today by his own power. If you could observe what he formerly produced in the astral body, you would see its likeness to the animal. It is really an inner force, such as this which gives the rubber man his present form. Imagine that this power is removed. Imagine man not fertilized by the Christ power. He springs back into the animal form. Thus it will happen to those who fall back. They will afterward form a world beneath the present world, so to speak, a world of the abyss, where man will again have assumed animal shape. Thus we learn to understand the direction evolution will indeed take. What is now being prepared will come out again bit by bit in the future, just as what was laid down in the Atlantean epoch has come out bit by bit in our epoch. I have said that in the last third of the Atlantean epoch, a small colony was formed, from which our cultures have been derived, and from which the 2 following ones still to come will also originate. It will be somewhat different in the next epoch, which will succeed all these cultures. There will not be a colony limited to one place, but from the general body of mankind will everywhere be recruited those who are mature enough to form the good, the noble, the beautiful side of the next civilization, after the war of all against all. This again is a step forward compared with the earlier Atlantean epoch, when the colony developed in one small place, while with us there is the possibility that from all races of the world will be recruited those who really understand the call of the earth mission, who raise up the living Christ within themselves, who develop the principle of brotherly love over the whole earth. And indeed, in the true sense, not in the sense of the Christian confessions, but in the sense of true esoteric Christianity, which can proceed from every culture. Those who understand this Christ impulse will be there in the period following the great war of all against all. After our present purely intellectual culture, which is now developing in the direction of the abyss of intellect, and you will find that this is the case in every field of life, there will come a time when man will be the slave of intelligence by which his personality will be submerged. Today there is only one way of preserving the personality, and that is to spiritualize it. Those who develop the spiritual life will belong to the small band of the sealed from all nations and races, who will appear in white garments after the war of all against all. We are now beginning to comprehend the spiritual world from our immediately present intellectual civilization. It is the aim of true anthroposophy to comprehend the spiritual world from out of the present intellectual standards, and to gather together those who can understand the call to spiritualize the world. These will not form a separate colony, but will be gathered from every nation, and will gradually pass into the sixth age, that is to say, not yet beyond the Great War, but to start with into the sixth age, for necessities still exist which are connected with old race ties. In our epoch, races and cultures are still intermingled. The true idea of race has lost its meaning, but it still plays a certain part. It is quite impossible at present for every mission to be carried out equally by every people. Certain nations are predestined to carry out a particular mission. The nations which today are the vehicles of Western culture were chosen to lead the fifth age to its zenith. They were the nations who were to develop the intellect. Hence, wherever this Western culture extends, we have predominantly the culture of the intellect, which is still not yet finished. This intelligence will spread still further. People will exercise still more of their spiritual forces in order to satisfy their bodily needs, to slay one another, that they will employ much greater spiritual forces before the great war of all against all. Many discoveries will be made in order to be able the better to carry on war. An endless amount of intelligence will be exercised in order to satisfy the lower impulses. But in the midst of it something is being prepared, with which certain nations of the East, the northern part of the East, are gifted. Certain nations are preparing to emerge from a certain dullness, and bring in a spiritual impulse with mighty force, an impulse which will be the opposite pole to intelligence. Before the sixth age, represented by the community of Philadelphia, we shall experience something like a mighty marriage of peoples, a marriage between intelligence and intellect and spirituality. At the present time, we are only experiencing the dawn of this marriage, and no one should mistake what is here said for a song of praise to our age. For one does not sing songs of praise to the sun when there are only the first signs of dawn. But we find remarkable phenomena when we compare East and West, when we look into the depths and foundations of the different nations. Do not let us look upon this as a desire to take sides. These lectures, which are intended to be objective, are far, far removed from any party spirit. But you may compare objectively what is attained as science and philosophy in the European West with what appeared in the East, let us say, in Tolstoy. One does not need to be a follower of Tolstoy, but one thing is true. In a book such as Tolstoy's title On Life, you may read one page, if you understand how to read it, and compare it with whole libraries in Western Europe. And you may then say the following. In Western Europe, one makes spiritual culture with the intellect. One chisels out certain details and puts them together to form something that is supposed to make the world comprehensible. And the achievements of Western European civilization in this respect will never be surpassed. But if you understand such a book as Tolstoy's On Life, you will often find condensed into 10 lines what in these Western European libraries it takes 30 volumes to say. Tolstoy says something with elemental force, and in a few lines of his there is the same amount of energy as is assembled in 30 such volumes. Here one must be able to judge what comes forth from the depths of the spirit, what has a spiritual foundation and what has not. Just as overripe cultures contain something that is drying up and withering, so do rising cultures contain within them fresh life and new energy. Tolstoy is a premature flower of such a culture, one that came far too soon to be fully developed. Hence he has all the faults of an untimely birth. His grotesque and unfounded presentations of many Western European things, all that he brings forward in the way of foolish judgment, show that great personalities have the faults of their virtues, and that great cleverness has the folly of its wisdom. This is only mentioned as a symptom of the future age, when the spirituality of the East will unite with the intellectuality of the West. From this union will proceed the age of Philadelphia. All those will participate in this marriage who take into themselves the impulse of Christ Jesus, and they will form the great brotherhood, which will survive the great war, which will experience enmity and persecution, but will provide the foundation for the good race. After this great war has brought out the animal nature in those who have remained in the old forms, the good race will arise, and this race will carry over into the future what is to be the spiritually elevated culture of that future epoch. We shall also have the experience that in our epoch, between the great Atlantean flood and the great war of all against all, in the age represented by the community of Philadelphia, a colony is formed, the members of which will not migrate, but will be everywhere, so that everywhere there will be some who are working in the sense of the community of Philadelphia, in the sense of the binding together of mankind, in the sense of the Christian principle.